Warning: this video essay contains spoilers for A Woman Under the Influence and Husbands. Frank discussions about mental illness occur throughout.
Oh, I hope you kids never grow up. Never. I never did anything in my whole life that was anything except I made you guys. I made you and you and you. Oh. Oh.
Hey, Nick, can I get a glass of water?
Yeah, Eddie, help make yourselves at home. Here, find a seat, fellas. Make yourselves comfortable.
In an early scene of John Cassavetes' brilliant 1974 film A Woman Under the Influence, Peter Falk's character, Nick, a construction foreman, is convinced by his employees after a long night of work to feed them lunch at his house. The night before, a water main burst downtown, and as a result, his men had to work all through the night without notice. When Nick arrives home, his wife, Mabel, played by John Cassavetes' wife, Gena Rowlands, seems to be acting strangely. Nick gave her no warning, and now over a dozen men are in her house expecting a hot meal, so you can forgive her for being angry. But she's not angry. Instead, she's perfectly calm, almost comatose. Slowly, Mabel rises from her bed and greets the men with friendly hugs and jokes. She yells at one of them for tracking mud in her house, and then she just grows increasingly bizarre throughout the meal until Nick embarrasses her.
Come on.
All right, everybody's tired. That's enough.
Come on. You want to dance?
No, no, Dan.
Vito Grimaldi.
Get your ass down!
Working outside of the studio system and using money from mortgaging their own house, Gena Rowlands and John Cassavetes produced a string of independent films from the 50s to the 80s that contain some of the most agitating, uncomfortable, and emotionally draining scenes in American cinema. While A Woman Under the Influence found creative success and landed Gena Rowlands an Oscar nomination for Best Actress and Cassavetes himself a nomination for Best Director, the films of Rowlands and Cassavetes were never financially viable at the box office. However, box office success was rarely the goal for Cassavetes and Rowlands. John took work on large studio films like Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby and Brian De Palma's The Fury, just so he could fund his own independent films. In some sense, the films of Cassavetes and Rowlands are so insular in their casting and locations and crews, they could be called home movies. But that notion makes it sound like these films are minor or amateurish in some way, but that's far from the truth. Even though his films may have been financial underperformers, actors, writers, and directors still call the films of Cassavetes and Rowlands some of the best and most influential in all of American independent cinema. Directors like Martin Scorsese, Jean-Luc Godard, Mike Leigh, Noah Baumbach, Wes Anderson, Paul Thomas Anderson, Lars von Trier, and the Safdie brothers have all claimed influence by Cassavetes at one time or another. The cinema verite style most associated with John Cassavetes has even entered the mainstream, perhaps most notably in the action genre with franchises like The Bourne Identity and The Hunger Games, using this style to heighten the realism of the tense fight scenes. While handheld cameras are the most immediate signifiers of his work, the style of Cassavetes is also found in composition and editing. His films lack traditional coverage, and they instead trade extreme close-ups and wide shots. The compositions rarely follow any formal rules, such as the rule of thirds or any kind of leading lines. This leads some critics to call his films artless or to inaccurately assess them as rushed or merely improvised. It's important to note that Cassavetes didn't invent any of these methods, but instead combined all of them to create an aesthetic we can typically point toward as a house style for his direction. Just like Wes Anderson didn't invent symmetrical framing or bright colors, these two weapons in his arsenal still point toward his main visual aesthetic. Cassavetes' use of handheld cameras, his extended scenes of conversation, his careful attention to realistic, clipped, or repetitive dialogue, all stand out against the backdrop of studio films from this era. When compared to the bloated historical and romantic epics of the 60s like Cleopatra, The Sound of Music, Dr. Dolittle, and My Fair Lady, the films of Rowlands and Cassavetes vibrate with transgressive visual language and emotional intimacy. Despite their singular style, Rowlands and Cassavetes were able to make a wide variety of movies in many different genres, from family dramas to crime noirs to screwball comedies. But what sets these films apart from many of Cassavetes' filmmaking contemporaries is the raw emotionality, the seeming lack of consideration for what's cool or popular, and the continued central focus of deeply flawed characters. The scenes in John Cassavetes' films tend to go on far longer than audiences are used to, and they tend to push the emotional boundaries and the patience of their audiences. Some critics of Cassavetes, most notably the New Yorker's legendary film critic Pauline Kael, felt Cassavetes mean-spirited as a storyteller and inconsistent at best as a filmmaker. In her review for A Woman Under the Influence, Kael says, Cassavetes' special talent is for showing intense suffering from nameless causes. Cassavetes gives us an actor's view of human misery. It comes out as metaphysical realism. We see the tensions and the power plays, but never know the why of anything. Cassavetes and Rowlands were never afraid to present the audience with complex, confusing, and sometimes infuriating characters full of hypocrisy and anger and sadness. But the issue many of their contemporary critics had about them was the refusal to specifically explain the why of these behaviors. A common misconception of these films is that they were largely improvised, both in plot and character and in their shooting and staging. But that's not true. Cassavetes scripted nearly every moment and every line of dialogue in these films, and through careful rehearsal and blocking, he and his actors were able to make films that feel improvised, but tell structured, layered stories. In the writing process, Cassavetes would sometimes play scenes out with improvisation, but during the actual production of the film, everything was written on the page.
I promised her on my life I'd be home tonight. I promised her that this night was going to be a love night, a special night, something. I didn't know this thing was going to happen. Water main in the middle of the night.
But you didn't even call her.
I can't call her. How am I going to call her? She already sent the kids to her mother's.
She'd climb the walls, break dishes, scream. Mabel's a delicate, sensitive woman.
Mabel's not crazy. She's unusual. She's not crazy, so don't say she's crazy.
Without saying it out loud, Rowlands communicates through her performance alone a stunted emotional intelligence and inability to regulate internal conflict. Mabel is a broken person, and broken people don't always know how to identify the problem or go about fixing it. The realism of Rowlands' portrayal creates unease for audiences. Should she be responsible for children? Should she be left alone in her home? What's going to happen to her? And who has her best interests in mind? Nick's confused about Mabel's behavior, and he's not sure how to help her. In 1974, mental illness was far more stigmatized than it is today, and conversations regarding mental illness were both less sensitive and less informed. A Woman Under the Influence, while absolutely a product of its time, also manages to portray Mabel's mental illness with much more nuance than one may expect. Disappointed that Nick has canceled their date, Mabel decides to leave the house and go to a bar where she meets a man. Mabel's an inscrutable character, to the audience and to those around her. Her decisions never seem to be entirely her own. After talking to the man at the bar for a few minutes, he invites himself over to her house. she accepts his advances with reluctance, but the man ignores her signs of hesitation. It's clear what the man wants when they get to Mabel's house, but she responds negatively to his advances, so he forces himself on her. The next morning, Mabel is confused to find this man in her house, almost like she doesn't remember the night before. Mabel chases him out of the house, calling him Nick, her husband's name. Mabel's confusion reinforces the viewer's fears regarding her mental stability. Fiction and reality merge together for Mabel, and the world she observes is quite different from the one we're observing alongside her. Nick understands Mabel's sensitivities, but he's unable or unwilling to put these issues into a clear perspective. Nick oscillates between coddling Mabel like a child and then treating her like a dangerous threat to his family. When Nick finally arrives home with his men for spaghetti dinner, the man from the bar is gone. And Mabel has forgotten completely about the man or the fact that her children are staying with her mother.
Aren't you going to ask where the kids are?
You're at your mother.
She runs around the house trying to find her family, and by the time Nick is able to find Mabel, she's sitting and staring into space. The first act of the film forces the audience to ask the same question over and over again. What is wrong with Mabel? What exactly is her mental illness? The film never answers these questions directly because it's not about what's wrong with Mabel, but more about the ways in which mental illness, untreated and misunderstood, can affect everybody in a family unit. Throughout the meal, Mabel entertains the men at her table. The scene is excruciating. Cassavetes allows the conversation to trail in unusual directions. It goes on for so long, and the tension builds to such heights that you're just waiting for some kind of emotional explosion to happen. This is how Cassavetes films operate. They're abrasive and unusual. You're charmed by characters, you're laughing with them, and you understand how somebody could fall in love with them, but at the same time, you're allowed into their lowest moments. You watch people get embarrassed or humiliated in front of their friends and family. You sit by as people tear into each other in venomous arguments. The closest filmmaker to the Cassavetes style would probably be Sweden's Ingmar Bergman, whose films are characterized by conversation, argument, and emotional vulnerability. However, to contrast the Bergman house style with its modular visual language and attention to controlled fury, there's a wildness to Cassavetes films that makes them feel dangerous. You don't feel like you're supposed to be here. You want to look away or fast forward or turn it off altogether if it means avoiding the embarrassment or shame these films force upon their viewers. A Woman Under the Influence encourages you to hate its characters, but also to love them. By the end of the film, if you're an empathetic person, you'll be exhausted by the emotional intensity of its sequences. Later in the film, a man named Harold Jensen brings his children over for a play date with Mabel's kids, but Mabel's erratic behavior frightens Mr. Jensen into sticking around and seeing what she will do.
I'm worried about the kids. About leaving them here with you.
Which kids?
About my kids leaving them here. And the reason I'm worried is that you've been acting a little strange. I wonder if you've been aware of that or not.
When Nick arrives home, he doesn't understand what's happening or why Mr. Jensen is sitting with Mabel in the bedroom. The two get into an altercation. Nick is at the end of his understanding when it comes to Mabel's behavior. Without any other options, he calls a doctor.
Well, I've been waiting. He's not here. Well, where could he be, Catherine? No, nobody's sick. Mabel's crazy. Where's Dr. Zepp? I mean, where is he, Catherine? He's not here. I'm sorry, Catherine. Now, could he stop off any place or what? No. I mean, is it going to be 5 minutes or 10 minutes? What is it going to be? Christ!
Cassavetes never allows the viewer to take a breath in these sequences. Instead, his focus is on discomfort. It's like visiting a friend's house when you're a child and witnessing their parents get into a fight. You feel trapped and embarrassed and you want to look away, but you're also compelled. You want to look into this other person's life, into this other person's problems. You don't even know why, but you want to listen, to see what's happening in this snapshot of another life. Cassavetes allows you into these personal spaces and asks you to watch as families rip each other apart, as relationships sour and break, and as people behave at their absolute worst in the confidence of their personal spaces. The scenes don't end when you think they will. They keep going. They get nastier. They fall deeper into despair, and you want nothing more than to look away, but you can't. Gena Rowlands' performance as Mabel Lungetti is rightly among the most revered in the history of American cinema, but equally important here is Peter Falk. Just as he is frightened of Mabel's state of mind, he's also in love with who she is. He expresses warmth and gratitude for her, but her beguiling nature also sends him into violent rage, fueled by shame. These are the worst weeks of the life of the Lungetti family. Mabel is unable to understand the seriousness of her situation, and none of the other characters are equipped to communicate with her. Mabel is sent away to an institution, and the film offers no easy answers on exactly what is wrong with her. If you suffer from a mental illness and you've been confronted with your behavior in ways you can't account for or in ways you can't explain, this sequence is one of the most honest and terrifying you're likely to ever see. While Mabel is gone, Nick proves himself to be equally unstable and dangerous as a parent. At work, he critically injures his employee in an altercation about Mabel's well-being. When spending time with his children, he allows them to consume alcohol to the point of drunkenness. At Mabel's welcome home party, Nick behaves just as erratically as Mabel. The film language of Cassavetes and Rowlands intentionally agitates the audience. At no point does the film expect the audience to be having a good time or to even be fully understanding how or why these events are unfolding. The camera follows the characters in handheld swings, barely keeping up with the complicated blocking of each scene. Each performance feels attuned to a different tone and a different genre, making every argument or conversation feel alive and real. Something you find in the work of famous directors and writers is that each performance can feel drawn from the same place. This isn't a criticism, but more of an observation. The performances in the films of directors like Tim Burton or Wes Anderson or Stanley Kubrick operate at similar temperatures. The films of John Cassavetes allow actors to bring their own sensibilities and styles to their performances, and that adds to the realism of these sequences. Peter Falk is the tightly wound and explosive man of a revenge film. Lady Rowlands is the apologetic and meek wife of a domestic drama. Catherine Cassavetes is the venomous villain of a film noir. But Gena Rowlands exists outside of any film genre in a performance so primal and specific that it feels closer to a bolt of lightning than a person. Nick doesn't know how to be a father. He's a raging mess. In an outing to the beach, Nick behaves irresponsibly and completely out of tune with the situation he is trying to create. He wants the day to be a fun memory for his children, but he bosses them around and screams for them to enjoy themselves. 6 months later, when Mabel returns, a light has been shut off. In the time between, she's been hollowed out. We don't know what they did to her there, but Nick's greatest fears have been confirmed. The hospital changed her. They took away the things he loved. The visual language has changed too. The camera is still. Mabel is still. The glass between the viewer and the film evaporates. Dialogue becomes meaningless. Rowlands conveys everything you need with just her eyes. The camera stays tight on Mabel as she processes her emotions, knowing she's being watched by everybody. Is she safe? Is she okay? Her children ask her the questions only children would ask. Mabel is heartbroken by the life she's had stolen from her. The scene is devastating, frustrating, and endless. Cassavetes and Rowlands offer nothing but the truth in these sequences, a truth which is repellent and oppressive and confrontational to any audience. A brave choice by any artist at any time, looking the viewer in the face with difficult, uneasy truth, allowing you to watch the complicated mess of real life.
It's just been such a long time. Oh, hello, banana.
Don't believe truth. Just don't believe truth. Archie, I'm telling you, don't believe truth.
That is the truth now. You see, the truth will never kill you. Lies will. Not cigarettes, not alcohol. Lies, guys. Lies intentions. That'll kill you. They'll kill you before cancer in the heart. Did you know that?
Yeah, give me a cigarette, will you? Give me a cigarette.
And now?
Yeah, now.
4 years before A Woman Under the Influence, John Cassavetes released his first independently produced film in color, Husbands. While A Woman Under the Influence uses the Cassavetes cinematic style to lend a watchful eye to the profound suffering found in the private moments of an American family, Husbands uses the unflinching eye of his long scenes of dramatic tension to puncture the fragile facade of masculinity. Husbands follows 3 characters played by the most common male leads of the Cassavetes independent films: Ben Gazzara, who plays Harry, Peter Falk, who plays Archie, and John Cassavetes himself, who plays Gus. The film follows these 3 men as they mourn the sudden loss of their childhood friend, and in their grief, go on a weekend drinking binge that sees them traveling to London to gamble in a casino. All 3 of these men act reprehensibly throughout the film. In their drunkenness, they goad each other on with juvenile, often offensive humor, disregard the safety of others and each other, and do everything they can to avoid thinking about their dead friend or their own aging bodies. They are now the same ages their parents were when they were kids, but they share none of the qualities they remember about the greatest generation. They've got no sense of pride in their homes or families, and they don't feel as if they've grown into the middle-aged people they should have by now. The men are instead constrained by the expectations of masculinity, and certainly the masculinity of their own fathers, and they've been given none of the tools nor the opportunities in their lives to learn how to process their emotions or develop their internal lives. All they have are the childhood games and patterns of behavior they've developed as a group of friends. The viewer never gets to meet their departed friend, Stuart, but they get an immediate sense that he was just as silly and childlike and immature as the rest of them. The only time the audience sees Stuart while he's alive is in the opening moments, when we see a gallery of snapshots from a pool party in which the men repeatedly flex their biceps together in different poses. Husbands is a film about the emotional fragility of masculinity and the resistance men have to showing their emotions or being vulnerable with those they love. Because of the privileges these men get to enjoy in society, there's nobody around them to dole out the necessary consequences to initiate a change in their own characters. Nobody in their families or their lives are able or willing to confront the men about the monsters they have become. But just as it's totally acceptable to read the movie as a boys will be boys comedic romp, it could also be seen as a cautionary tale about the lengths that some men will go, if you let them, to reconcile their own behavior with their conservative beliefs. If you are interested in movies with unlikable characters, then you are in luck, because you will find few movies with less likable characters than Husbands. These 3 men are maybe the most annoying and selfish people ever featured in a movie. They are misogynistic, brutish, rude. They humiliate people without remorse and face little to no consequence for any of their actions. They are absent fathers, despicable spouses, and have no sense of responsibility. The film is a series of sequences in which the men push the boundary of acceptability further and further. So why would anybody watch it? It's hard to identify what makes Husbands so compelling to watch, but part of its allure is its challenging nature. If you've seen the movie, it's possible that you, like me, see the early singing dinner scene as a gauntlet of sorts. To get through Husbands, you must go through the endurance test of this scene, which lasts for 22 excruciating minutes. Watching this scene is like reading the Proteus chapter of James Joyce's Ulysses or the opening 100 pages of The Tunnel by William H. Gass. It is a test to see how willing you are to bend and stretch your perception of entertainment or art or even taste itself. Maybe that's not appealing to you. You don't have to defend yourself. For those of you who seek out challenging art, who are excited by the transgressive nature of art breaking from convention, you may be interested in seeking out this film, if only to test your own endurance. Over a dozen people are seated around a table in a restaurant, each taking turns singing a song they want to remember Stewart by, and each person being constantly heckled and interrupted by our drunken protagonists. You cannot believe how long this scene lasts. And why is it here? The Cassavetes' sensibility is to be unflinching in the face of human indecency. These characters are deep in a grief they cannot process nor understand. So here they are, making everybody miserable to match their own interior struggles. Even you, the viewer, are forced to their level of depravity. Just as the characters in this scene rarely intervene to stop the behavior of the men, neither do you. You just sit there and let them behave this way. The movie continues beyond this dinner into a restaurant bathroom where our three protagonists spend an additional 30 minutes screaming, singing, fighting, throwing up, dry heaving. Harry goes home after the night-long bender and starts a fight with his wife, which ends in senseless violence, again, without consequence. And then just like that, Harry, Archie, and Gus take a plane to London. A woman under the influence reveals the darkest and lowest points of a working-class family, and all the secret battles they fight behind closed doors. The film examines how we hurt those we love the most with the ugly visual style of documentary. Husbands, in stark contrast, reveals the depravity of men when they don't fear consequence. Our three leads push each other to act their worst for the duration of the 142-minute runtime, and that same cinematic language that showed such empathy and compassion for Mabel Lungetti treats its targets here like animals caught in captivity. Instead of letting a scene end with a punchline or a joke that softens the men and excuses them of their behavior, the scenes linger inside of the discomfort this behavior causes everyone in the room. It's like if the Hangover movies showed you all the scenes in between the parts that made us laugh. It's this fearless refusal to cater to audiences that prevented the films of John Cassavetes from achieving true financial and critical success during his lifetime. But it's this same refusal that makes his films stand out now as some of our most honest examinations of gender expectations and social norms from the period in which they are set. John Cassavetes did not invent confrontational cinema, nor did he invent the documentary style of filmmaking he became so famous for. Instead of thinking of him as the originator of these elements, think of him as an important milestone in this specific synthesis. While Cassavetes brought these elements to fictional narrative cinema, the Maysles brothers were providing similar experiences in their documentaries. Films like Grey Gardens and Salesmen similarly combine the tones of comedy and tragedy to offer unique observations at their subjects with unflinching verity style. In the decades following the death of John Cassavetes, other directors have tried their hand at his cinematic approach. Noah Baumbach's Margot at the Wedding and Greenberg are overtly referential to films like Husbands and A Woman Under the Influence, and they provide similarly uncomfortable sequences of emotional intensity. In Denmark, directors Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg helped create the Dogma 95 movement. While their movement was based in part on an essay by Francois Truffaut, many of the hallmarks of Dogma 95 seem parallel to those found in the films of Cassavetes. Handheld camera, minimal set design, minimal music, and scenes which tend to last much longer than average. Dogma 95 films The Celebration and The Idiots are caustic enough and certainly agitating enough to hold their own when directly compared to films like Husbands. Newer films like Rick Alverson's 2012 film The Comedy starring Tim Heidecker is another example that fits nicely into the realm of these purposefully infuriating movies presented in a documentary style. However, none of these examples reach the dazzling heights of A Woman Under the Influence, perhaps the masterpiece of the creative partnership between Cassavetes and Rowlands, or at least tied with their later film Opening Night. Husbands plunges us into the depths of unchecked and toxic masculinity and the ruination it causes, and it makes us feel just as trapped and attacked as the men feel within their own midlife crises. A Woman Under the Influence interrogates its audience about their own family lives, their own parents and children and spouses, and wonders if we too have provided the same insensitivity to their needs in a time of crisis. The films of John Cassavetes confront the audience with the discomfort of reality, subverting the escapism of popular cinema and plunging us into the dark truths of our lives in sometimes unbearable ways. But here, in the final moments of A Woman Under the Influence, we see the full picture of family life. The film never lingers on these moments of darkness, but instead finds new opportunities to let light in. These people are not totally broken, nor are they irreparable, but they are just human beings in need of love.